Welcome to Leaf Status Report for January 3rd, 2026. Some minor issues with lag caused our simulation to be cut off a little bit earlier than usual today. So today we've simulated the rest of the NHL regular season 4,851 times, with the Leafs' performances across all simulated seasons forming this distribution. Yesterday, we were focused on only one game happening in the NHL, and luckily for us, it went about as well as we could have hoped it to. The Rangers managed to beat the Panthers 5-1, which of course is going to have a notable effect on the Leafs' playoff odds in today's projections. The Leafs gained 0.22 expected points today, going from 91.32 expected points yesterday to 91.54 expected points today. Our problem with this is that none of this gain actually comes from game effects. Their entire gain is randomness alone today. Substituting all of yesterday's game data into today's simulations actually yielded a loss of 0.03 expected points. There was no change in overtime games, which means that our net controllable factor expected points change was minus 0.03 expected points. Overall, this means that randomness favored the Leafs by 0.25 expected points more today than it did yesterday. Additionally, I did calculate the theoretical value of our expected points that we should have gotten in a perfect set of simulations today, and I have come up with the fact that today's a bit of an outlier, and collectively our simulations conducted today overestimate the Leafs by on average 0.27 expected points. This will almost inevitably be resolved tomorrow. That overestimation or underestimation will almost certainly be very much closer tomorrow. This did happen before, and it did fix itself, so to speak. We just got very lucky with the Leafs simulations today. The minimum number of points the Leafs scored in a simulated season today was 71, and the maximum number of points they scored today was 113. That gives us an absolute range today of 42 points. Our inner 70% interval widens just slightly to a width of 13 points, but luckily it does widen to the right. Our 15th percentile season remains constant at 85 points, but our 85th percentile season increases by 1 point up to 98 points. Our standard deviation widens ever so slightly. Yesterday it was 5.91 points, and today it's up to 5.99 points. The Leafs managed to gain 2% on their playoff odds today. Yesterday, they made the playoffs in 35.5% of all simulations, and today they've made the playoffs in 37.5% of all simulations. Our 95% confidence interval for our playoff odds today sits at 1.36%. I will say, as note, because of the large overestimation on average across all our simulations today, it is likely that some of that playoff odds gain does come from the fact that the Leafs got very lucky in today's simulations, but I do think that a notable amount of that 2% gain is still actual, in the sense that it will still be present in our simulations tomorrow. Looking at our general EP spread across the entire league, the Leafs are back up to 17th place in the league in terms of expected points. However, again, the race remains fairly close. There are still 18 teams within one standard deviation of the Leafs in expected points at the moment. Taking a look at the table, we can see that our simulations today place the Leafs firmly in wildcard 5 today, up from the wildcard 6 position they were holding yesterday. However, it is of course worthy to note that because based on the theoretical value we calculated, the Leafs are overestimated by about on average 0.27 expected points. They're likely more accurately sitting about flush in wildcard 5 and 6 with the Pittsburgh Penguins. If we add 0.27 to the gap the Penguins have on the Leafs, it does put them actually about 0.02 points ahead of the Leafs. Of course, under the assumption that the Pittsburgh Penguins' expected points value today sits about where their theoretical value is. Running over the basic margins for today, and again, you can add about 0.27 expected points to all of these margins to get what we'd expect to see if the rest of these Eastern Conference teams sit about where they would in their theoretical values of expected points. The Leafs now sit 17.76 expected points behind the division-leading Tampa Bay Lightning, 7.01 expected points behind second in the Atlantic, still held by Montreal, 3.67 expected points behind third in the Atlantic, still held by Detroit, and they now sit about 1.54 expected points outside of the playoffs. It is, of course, worth mentioning that even if we do add the about 0.27 expected points the Leafs are being overestimated by, that gap outside of the playoffs is still notably below 2 expected points. I would always call about 2 expected points the level at which we could say that the Leafs could reasonably, with a very good performance in one game, get themselves into the playoffs by the next day. So we will get there when we discuss the Leafs game today. The one other thing that is worth mentioning is because the Florida Panthers got destroyed yesterday by the Rangers, they have dropped down to that wildcard 3 spot, and that gap has closed to also below 2 expected points, which means that the Leafs are fairly poised to catch them with a good performance tonight. As recompense for the fact that I only had to worry about 1 key game yesterday, today I have to worry about 6. At 7 p.m., the New York Islanders host the Toronto Maple Leafs. This game is basically 50-50 odds. And in addition, because the New York Islanders currently sit in wildcard 4, this game is essentially for position. If the Pittsburgh Penguins beat the Detroit Red Wings, then they're likely playing for wildcard 5 tomorrow. If the Pittsburgh Penguins lose to the Detroit Red Wings in probably about any fashion, this is for the wildcard 4 position or better, depending on how the other teams in front of the Leafs do. Speaking of the Penguins, they're being hosted by the Detroit Red Wings at noon today. Of course, based on the fact that the Penguins have an expected points yield of 1.09, basically all we're hoping for is that they perform worse than the Leafs. So if the Leafs lose in overtime, we want the Penguins to lose in regulation. As for the other team below the Leafs, at 3 p.m., the New Jersey Devils host the Utah Mammoth. It's a very similar story to the Pittsburgh Penguins, but with a bit of a wider gap to play with. I don't think we'd be particularly mad if the New Jersey Devils lose in overtime. It is still a slight underperformance. And I think unless the Leafs lose by 4 or 5 goals, they're not going to be catching the Leafs by tomorrow. But ideally, they do lose in regulation. Of the remaining 3 games, the 3 teams we want to focus on the most are likely the Buffalo Sabres, the Ottawa Senators, and the Philadelphia Flyers. Similar to the position the Islanders were in a couple days ago, if the Flyers lose their game by a considerable margin, they'll likely be a wild card team tomorrow, especially if the Islanders do beat the Leafs. As for the Sens and Sabres, they're both wildcard teams essentially by default tomorrow. I don't think either is going to make up the over 1.5 expected points gap they'd need to pass the Detroit Red Wings for a spot in the Atlantic. Of the 3 teams here, the Philadelphia Flyers are the easiest to deal with. They have an expected points yield very slightly below 1, so the only result we'd really be particularly happy about or care about is if they lose in regulation. The other 2 teams, the Sabres and Senators, both have expected points yields above 1. However, how you look at acceptable outcomes depends on whether or not you think the Leafs are going to win tonight. If you think the Leafs are going to win tonight, you're perfectly fine with an overtime loss from both of these teams. I don't think it fully closes the gap if the Leafs win and both lose in overtime, but it certainly closes the gap below 1 expected point, which puts the Leafs in striking distance for their next game against the Panthers. If you think the Leafs can beat the Islanders and also the Panthers, you're fine with both these teams losing in overtime. But if you think the Leafs are going to lose either of those games, you'd likely want to see a regulation loss from at least one, if not both of these teams. Quick view on the Canadian teams. Nothing has changed. All the Canadian teams do make very slight gains. And overall, the number of Canadian teams in the playoffs goes up to 3.11 today, broken down into this. President's Trophy, no surprise. Colorado Avalanche, 97.7% chance.